In this video, we're going to take a look at variables and types in Python, and we're just going to use the interpreter to do that. We've been using the interpreter in previous notes and video to look at how you can just perform simple arithmetic calculations in Python, and how the interpreter processes essentially a Python program, but just one line at a time as we type it in. And then finally, also just a reminder that there are a couple of things in the interpreter to help you. The history of commands you've typed in, so the up and down arrow to do that, and of course the help command as well. Working in the interpreter, variables give us a much greater ability to do useful things with a program, or with just working in the interpreter. Up until now, we've just been adding numbers together like 2 plus 2 and finding out what that equals. But as soon as we've finished doing that, Python's forgotten the calculation essentially, and there's no record or no storage of the information that we've worked with. So let's just say for a moment that whatever that 2 plus 2 represents is actually worth remembering. Maybe it's the cost of something that we need to know that we're calculating. So instead of just performing the arithmetic calculation and losing the information, we're instead going to type in our calculation this way, where we start off with a name, the name's cost, and then an equal sign. Now this equal sign has a special name in programming. It's called assignment, which essentially means it's going to take whatever's on the right hand side of the equal sign and calculate what that is, or perform whatever calculations it needs to do, and then put that value in the name on the left hand side. And that will allow us to do something with that value and remember what that value is at a later time. So we've done that, and if we ask Python what cost is, it tells us that it's the number 4. Now let's say that we added another item onto our cost. We want to add that onto the already existing sum of $4 that we've already calculated. We say want to add yet another $2 onto that, and we can do that using assignment again, and using kind of a combination of the first 2 lines we've done, the first line being a type of assignment, and this second line essentially being retrieval of that value. So if I ask Python to make a calculation where it retrieves the current value, which at last here we saw what it was last, it was 4. So it retrieves the value 4 and adds 2 more onto it, and then after calculating that, assigns that back into the variable of the name cost. So we've added 2 more onto 4. We should expect that that would be 6, and when we ask Python what that is, we get back the value 6. Now we can only do this kind of calculation that we just did if the variable's already been created. So for instance, let's just say I was using another variable, length, and I wanted to add 2 onto that. This is going to cause us a problem. Up until now, I haven't created a variable called length. It doesn't yet exist. So when Python went to calculate on the right side before assigning it into the value on the left, it went to look up what this value of length was, and it got a certain type of error. In this case, it's a name error. An error basically unable to retrieve the particular name length, and here it is, name length is not defined. It's not been created yet. So using variables can generate new types of errors, and in particular this name error is something to watch out for. It simply means that your variable that you've typed in doesn't exist, and this can happen in all sorts of ways. Let's say for whatever reason you've mistyped cost, you hit the letter P rather than O, and you'll see now that this variable name, this misspelt variable name cost misspelt, is not defined. The same error. But this is a very powerful feature of a programming language. It allows us to uh, write a value into memory. There's, that value that we calculated up here that we put into the variable cost at the very beginning of 4. That value is actually stored somewhere physically on the machine inside of a RAM chip somewhere, and a series of very small electric charges were stored somewhere to represent the number 4. Now variables can be more than just integer numbers, and so I'd like to kind of switch into thinking about the types of information or the kinds of information that we're able to store in variables for a moment, rather than how we actually do it. So going back to our original variable of that we had called cost, is currently the value 6. We can ask Python, well, what kind of information do you think that is? What is it that you're storing? Not what the value is, not what the actual value of the variable is, but what kind of information did you store in that variable? Because as you can imagine, storing information inside of a computer program is a very particular kind of thing. It's going to store, for instance, a number like the number 6. Is perhaps going to store that a little differently than if we were to give it in some way we were supposed to store some information in a variable that would be like a page of text. Those two things would probably be stored differently in the computer, and the computer needs to be able to kind of deal with those things just like we deal with different types of things in the real world. We classify things all the time. If you think of animals perhaps, and how we've, or all kinds of living creatures in biology, how we've classified those into different categories of things. And in here we have different types of information, different categories of information. And our first example is a number without a decimal place, and Python considers that an integer. Now if we were to have another variable, let's say we were going to use that length variable, and we made some kind of measurement, and it was 2.5 centimeters perhaps, we could do that. Python seems to be fine with the idea of storing a decimal number as well, and if we go and kind of retrieve that value by just typing in the variable name again, it gives us back the 2.5. And so if we ask for the type in this case, we'll see it's what's called a float. Now float is different from an integer. Float is kind of a short form name for floating point. A floating point number is a number with a decimal that can move around. So these are our two main types of numbers we're going to deal with for the most part, integers and floats. And then the other type of information that we might be storing for the time being are what's called strings. So this might be an example of a string. It's a group of characters inside of quotes. Now it doesn't matter whether it's single quotes or double quotes, as long as they are the same, as long as you're consistent. So here we have a variable named title, and it's set to the value ICS 201. And if we ask Python, well, what kind of type is that? It tells us string, which is essentially a string of letters or a sequence of characters. So those are our three types that we're going to use, and they're all being stored inside of variables. And just one other thing to be aware of is that the types can influence how certain other operations are carried out. So just to point this out, the 2 plus 2, these are both the number 2 with no decimal. These are both integers. If we add those together, we get the value 4. But if I were to say 2 plus 2 equals 22, you would think that that's crazy. But of course, if you think of 2 as a kind of character 2, and you use the addition operator on different characters, you'll end up doing what's called concatenation, and you'll kind of string together those characters one after another, and you'll end up with 2 plus 2 equaling 22. So types are very important, very critical thing to understand as early as possible. Everything in the Python programming language is going to belong to a certain type of a certain category of information, and for the beginning part of the course especially, those are often going to be these three different types of information: an integer number, a float, a decimal number, or a string of characters.